Hello road brothers and sisters. Today I am way too chirpy to be talking about what I'm going to talk about because I'm going to talk about a Grimdark fantasy series, and it is my favorite fantasy series actually. So this is going to be a non-spoiler review, wrap-up, overview, my general thoughts on the Broken Empire Trilogy by Mark Lawrence. It consists of Prince of Thorns, King of Thorns, and Emperor of Thorns. And down here at the bottom, I have this very nice edition from the Broken Binding, which is the 10th anniversary edition. I'm going to put them all down and I'm going to show it to you. It's got nice Jason Chan cover, or Jason Chan art on the cover, and a nice quote on the back. Nice sprayed edges. It's all black and edgy, like my soul. And it's just, yeah, sums up this series. This trilogy is one of the main reasons I wanted to join Booktube. I wanted to get one of these videos out there and maybe have more discussions about this trilogy and Mark Lawrence in general as a writer. I think this series has developed a sort of reputation among the small Booktube sphere that we are in. While I agree with some things, I disagree with a lot of things, so I just want to be a different voice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why the Broken Empire is my favorite fantasy trilogy. There's a number of superficial reasons, stylistically, aesthetically, just tonally, genre blendy reasons, and then the ones that make this series stick in my brain are a little deeper, a little more between the lines, personal reasons, and just the major themes that I see. So I'm going to keep it non-spoilers. I'm going to talk about why I think this series is ultimately about empathy, existentialism, and just overcoming trauma or something in your life that is affecting you psychologically and emotionally, that is out of your control. Just overcoming that. I think that is the main message of this trilogy. And I'm also going to talk about some things like middle book syndrome concept and why I think this series smashes that completely. And also challenge the notion, this abstract grimdark term that we throw around, which these books absolutely fit into the grimdark subgenre, but I would challenge the notion that these books are inherently nihilistic. I understand where that opinion comes from, but I think if you stick with the trilogy and you get to the end of Emperor and you think that the message of this trilogy is still nihilistic, I just don't agree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that is. I'm also going to pepper in some quotes along the way to make myself look real important and like I know what I'm talking about, even though I don't really. And I have some sticky notes to help me, because I know people on Booktube like sticky notes. So first of all, why is this my favorite series? Well, on a surface level, I picked up the series because the cover really appealed to me. I like dark, edgy shit. And some of the reviews that I had read of Prince of Thorns piqued my interest just for how controversial the main character seemed to be. Jörg Ankrath is obviously, as we would say in Dublin, a bit of a bollocks. And that seems to cause some conversation and debate amongst fantasy readers. And obviously this book, or this trilogy, is marketed as a fantasy trilogy, which is interesting as well. How this book is marketed genre-wise could affect how people view it. I picked it up originally just for the aesthetic and the fact that it seemed to be the antithesis to the hero's journey. It's the villain's journey, essentially. So I picked up Prince of Thorns and I read it like that, and I really enjoyed it. And the writing, the mood, the atmosphere that Mark Lawrence sets, the way he uses poetic prose to set that oppressive tone is just really my vibe, my cup of tea. But I enjoyed the book. I didn't think about it too deeply, and it was King of Thorns that really flicked the switch for me on what this series was really about. It was like a turning of the key inside my head or inside my gut, because a lot of the feelings that it was evoking were sort of unspoken, deep-rooted feelings that I couldn't necessarily vocalize or verbalize or even recognize until a few weeks after I had finished that book and really thought about it. So, surface level, I love the blend of genres. The dark, gothic, fantasy, horror almost tone of it. It's sort of reminiscent. I recently read Elric by Michael Moorcock, the first novella anyway, and that kind of sword and sorcery, lone anti-hero, very metal descriptions. You can almost imagine listening to some really gothic 80s rock like the Sisters of Mercy or something. I could see it visually, and I am quite a visual reader in terms of atmosphere and setting and mood, and I just enjoy that kind of gothic horror type aesthetic. There's also elements of the world building that bring in splashes of sci-fi, and I just really, really love that. I'm not going to go into any spoilers, but I think it's become fairly known now that Mark Lawrence likes to sort of smash those genre boundaries, and that is something that really works for me. I'm not usually the biggest fan of the conventional story, even though I like a lot of conventional stories. So it's a bit of a contradiction, but there are a lot of contradictions within this series, and I think Mark Lawrence is great at posing questions, but I'll get to that when I talk about theme. On a deeper level, why did this hit me so hard? Basically, I've mentioned in a couple of videos before, one of my favorite themes in any form of literature, film, or anything is empathy. And I'm making a list in my head of some of my favorite films, my favorite video games, my favorite books, and I think the theme that always sticks with me most is empathy. I'm thinking of The Last of Us Part 2. That game is all about empathy to me. I'm thinking about Interstellar, King of Thorns. All of these books, to me, the central theme is about empathy. And I would also want to push back a little bit on the idea that these books are nihilistic, because I find them to be inherently existentialist. One reviewer that I have found over the last couple of years that I tend to agree with some of what he says, particularly about the theme of existentialism, is Philip Chase, from the channel Philip Chase, and he argues that Jorg is essentially on an existentialist journey, and I completely agree with that. But I also think he's on a psychological, emotional journey in overcoming things that are inherently out of his control but are affecting his psychological makeup. He becomes far more introspective as the series goes forward, and I'll kind of talk about each individual book and how they are written stylistically, and maybe the kind of reader they might suit. The other big theme, and it seems to be a recurring theme in Mark Lawrence's work, is memory, and he uses non-linear narratives to do this. You could add a comparison to something like Memento, the film by Christopher Nolan, how the memories piecing together, or the lost memories that he needs to recover, make the man. So memories maketh man, I think, is a big theme across all three books. Uncomfortable questions that he poses, such as nature versus nurture, or the nature of evil. Is Jorg inherently evil because he does evil things, predominantly in the first book, but he continues to do evil things as the series progresses and as he progresses as a character? And then confronting that inner bollocks, that inner monster. So there's sort of a difference for me between that inner darkness that a character has and then just this counterbalance that I find is quite a cultural thing, maybe in this part of the world as well, that is a sense of humor in the face of that. So when you're coming out of that period or that psychological state or emotional state in your life and you mature and you become a more secure adult, having a sense of humor in that and winking at that inner monster, I find it comes across in these books, and I just connect to that on a personal level. It clicked for me. I really liked that examination of the character. So a little example of the nature versus nurture questions that he poses a lot, and that inner bollocks that I keep mentioning, with a little bit of a cheeky sense of humor. There's a scene here where Jorg is in the circus and he finds a lion trapped in a cage. "He's called Macedon," Sarah said, leaning into me. "The crowds love him." "He looks hungry," I said. "The circus can't feed its main attraction." "He won't eat," Sarah said. "Taproot's tearing his hair out about it. Doesn't know how long he'll last." The lion watched us, sat sphinx-like with his massive paws spread in the straw before him. I met his huge amber eyes and wondered what he saw. Probably a hunk of meat on two legs not meant for running. "He wants to hunt," I said. "We give him meat. Ron cuts him big hunks of cow, still bleeding. He barely sniffs it." "He needs to take it," I said, "not be given it." "That's silly." Her fingers ran along mine, starting fires. "It's in his nature." I looked away. I didn't think I could win a staring competition with Macedon, even if I had time to try. "You should let him go," I said. Sarah laughed, a note too shrill for comfort. "And what would he hunt? We should let him eat children?" A distant scream saved me from answering. A distant scream and a tongue of flame reaching up above the tent tops. So a distraction happens. My gaze returned to the lion, who seemed wholly unmoved by the excitement. "Do you think Taproot will still want Gog in his freak show now?" I asked. The lion gave no answer. Just watched me with those amber eyes. The lions the Nuban had told me of were magnificent beasts, lords of the plains. He understood why men who had never seen one might fight beneath their likeness on a banner. When he spoke of lions on cold nights camped along the roadside, I had sworn to walk those same sun-scarred plains and see them for myself. I hadn't imagined them caged, mangy, hopping with fleas beside a two-headed goat. A single nail pinned the cage door, secured with a twist of wire. I had pulled a single pin to set the Nuban free years ago, worlds ago. I pulled a pin and he took 2 lives in as many moments. That Jorg would have pulled this pin too. That Jorg would have pulled this pin and not given a moment's thought to children clustered around a sword swallower, to the livelihoods of dancers and tumblers, to townsfolk, or to Taproot's revenge. But I'm not him. I'm not him because we die a little every day, and by degrees we're born into different men, older men in the same clothes, with the same scars. I didn't forget the children or the dancers or the tumblers, but I pulled the pin because it's in my nature. Mark Lawrence has beautifully poetic prose. He has a way of turning a phrase and describing a feeling or a sentiment or an experience with, maybe it's a metaphor that's a bit on the nose, or maybe it's just through a situation or something that Jorg has to go through within the books, that you can take and apply to a completely different situation. And not taking it literally, of course, Jorg does a lot of deplorable things in these books, but taking the underlying sentiment, Mark Lawrence is really good at twisting that idea, that feeling, that experience, and twisting the dial to 11 and really showing it to you in a sensational lens, but then leaving it there with you as Jorg becomes more reflective. So I want to address some of the negatives that I see about this series online. So what makes it controversial, and maybe some of the criticisms, and why all of those criticisms are valid, of course, but why I maybe disagree with some of them. So the first being, the big one, is that Jorg is such a reprehensible character. I can't follow this character. That is absolutely understandable. That is absolutely fine. If you find yourself reading Prince of Thorns and you cannot get behind this character, it is very intentionally written in the first person, so you are in his head. And Prince of Thorns, just to break down the books for a second, is written in an intentionally edgy and outwardly aggressive way. So there is a basic plot in Prince of Thorns where Jorg Ancrath is essentially on a quest, on a journey to go back to his home castle and confront his uncle. I'm not going to spoil too much about what happened to Jorg as a child, but he had a traumatic experience directly related to his uncle, and Prince of Thorns is about him going back and confronting his uncle. So it sets up the basic plot, and it's quite propulsive. Prince of Thorns is a short book. It's quite a punchy book. The chapters are short. It's written in a very, almost like it's shouting at the reader, and because you're in Jorg's head. But I think what you need to remember is that Jorg is a 14-year-old in that book. His traumatic experience was 5 years previous to that. So his growth is from a 9-year-old to a 14-year-old. And it's very understandable that that book will be written in that way. But if you're a fantasy reader who enjoys fast, propulsive, fairly entertaining and unpredictable plot with cool necromancy magic, Prince of Thorns could be a really fun book for you, because it's also very entertaining, and there is a constant undercurrent of a sense of humor in these books. At least to me, there might be some cultural differences there, that some things that may not land comedically or with like sarcasm and just dark, dry humor, or maybe some slightly fucked up humor. Some of that might not land with everybody, so just to be aware of that. And then obviously you're forced to be in his head. So if you can't get past that, this series is probably not for you. But if you're willing to go on an emotional journey with this character, I think to be aware that coming to King of Thorns, then it shifts very much into not a plot-driven fantasy series. It's leaning towards literary fiction with fantasy gothic horror window dressing, because I find this to be an intensely psychological, introspective character study of one really damaged individual and his journey to maybe fixing or healing some of that damage. Most of all, though, as boys do when they're hurt, and at 14 I discovered I was still a boy if the hurt came fierce enough, I thought of my mother. I remembered how I twisted and moaned on the slopes after Sindri left me, the agony that held me, and the thirst I had, nearly as large as the pain. I would have fitted well amongst the dying at Mabberton, amongst the wounded that I had watched with a smile, coiled about their hurts, calling for water. And when pain bites, men bargain. Boys too. We twist and turn, we plead and beg, we offer our tormentor what he wants so that the hurting will stop. And when there is no torturer to placate, no hooded man with hot irons and tongs, just a burn you can't escape, we bargain with God, or with ourselves, depending on the size of our egos. I made mock of the dying at Mabberton, and now their ghosts watched me burn. Take the pain, I said, and I will be a good man, or if not that, a better man. We all become weasels with enough hurt on us, but I think a small part of it was more than that. A small part was that terrible two-edged sword called experience, cutting away at the cruel child I was, carving out whatever man might yet be to come. I promised a better one, though I have been known to lie. So I can understand if you're reading it and say you've enjoyed Prince of Thorns, you've enjoyed the plot and it's entertaining and you want to see what he goes and does next. You may be disappointed that he spends a lot of time just thinking and reflecting on his psychology in King of Thorns. There is still a plot. So in King of Thorns, it's not a spoiler because it's not that important. He is king of a certain region. And there is a prince coming to lay siege to his castle. And this prince is intentionally a knight in shining armor, a blonde-haired, strapping young man called the Prince of Arrow, who's coming to lay siege to Jorg's castle. And Jorg has to deal with him. But it's established quickly that this is a character-driven story about Jorg. We're in his head. This is another reason why a lot of readers maybe bounce off these books, is that the plot is slow and meandering. I completely agree with that. I understand bouncing off the books for that reason, but these are not plot-driven books. They, as I said, are character-driven books. I think those terms are sometimes misused from what I see. I see sometimes books being books that I would maybe look at and say they're plot-driven books with great characterization, be labeled as character-driven books. I really don't think these books are that. So I've also seen some criticism that the titles of the books themselves are spoilers, but I think Mark Lawrence gets it across to the reader that that is inconsequential to what the books are trying to say. The main criticism of Jorg himself is that he's a one-note edgelord psychopath. I think it's unfair to label him as a psychopath. He is clearly, in King and Emperor, unsuppressing that empathy that he has suppressed because of trauma or whatever, or because decisions that he's just making. But his conscience is chipping away at him with a little rock hammer. The more you go through the books, and then by the time you get to Emperor, I think he is quite a changed man, a more secure, calm, and self-assured person who changes from selfish, angry at the world, snotty teenager who does horrible things into a mature, more reflective, more self-actualized person who maybe thinks a bit more selflessly. One thing as well, one major thing is, I think a common criticism that is valid is the use of the plot device of rape and sexual assault. I, going into the book, expected this to be more explicit or more shocking. I think it's mentioned in passing, and then we're definitely told that Jorg or his road brothers have done that in the past. But I think the focus then of the books after that brief mention in the first chapter of Prince of Thorns are focused on Jorg realizing that he's running with a rough crowd and that he didn't know any better. And I think there are scenes that explicitly then reference that and confront that, and he is forced to confront that within himself. So I think it's still interesting in that regard, but if you don't want to read about that, that's absolutely fine, it's understandable. I just don't think that the book is glorifying it in any way. I think it's explicitly saying that the things that this kid does in Prince of Thorns is horrible, but let's examine him psychologically going forward, where he becomes more reflective about everything that he does. The themes. We've said that the series is essentially about a young, scorned prince, or thorned prince, on a quest to confront his family, but ultimately the most important aspect of these books is its exploration of theme of empathy, existentialism, and Jorg's psychological growth. I think there's also a bit of a humanist slant to it, where he learns to pull back a little bit and focus on what's really important and focus on the people around him as well. In Prince of Thorns, we find Jorg behaving how he sees the world. So his behavior matches his worldview, and how his worldview evolves through the series, his behavior evolves. He becomes more reflective. He thinks a bit more critically about how his outward actions affect the people around him. And then he starts questioning his own morality as that worldview starts to shift. And I think Mark Lawrence accomplishes this really well by having the character of Sir Mackin in there and examining this really interesting male friendship where you have Jorg in a certain period of his life and Mackin, who is significantly older but also a damaged person. Well, maybe he's already in this more secure, calm stage of his life, or this psychological state, but he still has that internal anger, and he has himself suffered tragedy in his life. I was consumed by me, by what I wanted. Nothing else mattered. Not my life, not anyone's life. All of it was a price worth paying. All of it was worth staking on long odds just for the chance to win. Mackin snorted. That's a place everyone visits on their way from child to man. You just went native. I don't want to say too much about what has happened to Jorg. We learn more and more about the tragedy that he's suffered throughout his life as the books go on. And a lot of it could be very uncomfortable to read about. So again, you have to be in on the journey if you want to read these books. You need to be aware that you're in Jorg's head as he begins to unlock the memories and really confront why he's behaving the way he's behaving. I had been a foolish child. Sometimes I wished I could cut away old memories and let the wind take them. If a sharp knife could pare away the weaknesses of those days, I would slice until nothing but the hard lessons remained. Mark Lawrence has this way with prose that sometimes he makes the most horrendous scenes in these books read beautifully. So the prose that he uses is beautiful. And then thinking as well about the sense of humor, some of the dark, twisted shit that he describes is some of the most beautiful prose that he has. And there's often an edgy humor to it that just really works for me. Another thing that really works for me is the structure and the non-linear narrative with that unreliable narrator. It's very Christopher Nolan-y, and I like that structure of storytelling. It's always worked for me, but I know that can be quite divisive. A lot of people aren't actually into that. Some people say that can detract from the pacing, whereas I don't think these books are slow at all. But I'm in it for that psychological journey. I'm reading for that emotional journey, and I think Mark Lawrence delivers on that promise that he sets. I want to talk a little bit about the middle book syndrome concept that is fairly new to me, because I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot in fantasy circles online. I gotta say, to me, it's directly tied to maybe plot-driven books. So I want to use an example, and I don't want to be negative about the example, but I recently read The Stone of Farewell by Tad Williams, which is book 2 in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. I think Tad Williams is a wonderful writer. I really liked that book, but Tad Williams establishes very quickly in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn that you have a plot-driven fantasy book. It's a traditional, conventional story that has good characters, and it's got good characterization. But the promise there is to arrive at a point early on, or he says early on that you're going to arrive at a point, and then you're waiting to arrive at that point. And he takes his time. That sets my expectations a certain way. So I found that book to be quite slow for me, where Tad took quite a long time to arrive at the point that he establishes in the beginning of that book. I find that King of Thorns smashes this idea of middle book fantasy syndrome because the point is the journey. So the point is being made along the way with Jorg's psychological growth and with his introspection and internal monologues, thinking about how he's changing and why he is the way he is. Also, the non-linear structure, he uses this device, a plot device, where Jorg is carrying around this memory box that has basically traumatic memories locked away, and he carries it around on his person. And throughout King of Thorns and Emperor, he'll tap into it and he'll look at one. As he gets stronger, as he heals, he will confront that memory that he's locked away. I just think that on its own, structurally, is an interesting concept to me. I love films like Memento, like I said, but thematically, that's a really interesting thing to think about, and he poses a lot of interesting questions using this device. He doesn't always give you answers, but he just leaves you sitting there going, well, how would you react to this? Or what would you do in this situation? What kind of person could you conceivably become if this is the world that you're in and these are the experiences that you have? And I find that really fascinating. And literature is obviously the safe space to ask those uncomfortable questions and to examine those darker sides of human life. I recently found out that he wrote Prince of Thorns after going through quite a traumatic event where his daughter was born severely disabled. And I think that comes across in how Prince of Thorns is written. Again, that outward aggression that Jorg is expressing in Prince of Thorns, it feels like it's a senseless, erratic anger that is just, it's all going in one direction and there's nothing coming in, if that makes sense. So like there's no listening, it's just unleashing this anger that's got nowhere to go. I find that then when the shift happens and the conventional plot gets slower or dialed down to zero in King and Emperor, we start to reflect on that anger, and you kind of go through that curve of shock, anger, rejection, acceptance, and then by the end of Emperor we arrive at acceptance. So here Jorg is climbing a mountain. There are no half measures in such a sense. You place everything you are or will be on each decision. Lives can be lived in this manner, but I do not recommend it. In the end, though, everybody dies, but not everybody lives. The climber, though he may die young, will have lived. There comes a point on a long climb where you know you have to surrender or die. There's no quarter given. I hung to cold stone 50 feet beneath the summit, weak as a child, aching with hunger, blistered hands and feet, arms screaming. The art of survival in the mountains is knowing when to give up. The art of reaching the top is knowing when not to. When you're climbing, you take nothing with you that you do not absolutely need. That's a good discipline to acquire, and the mountains teach it to you for free. They say that time is a great teacher, but unfortunately it kills all its pupils. The mountains are also great teachers, and better still, they let the occasional star pupil live. The mountains teach you to be prepared for change. Amongst the peaks, the weather can shift from fair to foul, quick as blinking. One moment you might be clambering up a forgiving slope, and the next you could be clinging to it as though it were your mother, whilst an east wind tries to carry your frozen corpse off with it. Climbing God's finger, I learnt a lot about holding on by my fingertips. By the time I finally hauled myself weak and trembling onto the very top of the spire, I had come to realize that I'd been holding on by my fingertips my entire life. And I just think this highlights the existentialist slant that this series has, and that it's not nihilistic. So I think for anyone reading it who might be going through a tough time or had a period of darkness or gone through depression or a traumatic event or an illness or something in the world that is completely out of your control and it feels unfair, it creates that deep-rooted anger in you at why did this happen to me. This is a universal experience that happens to everybody at some stage in your life. And I just find that this series examines that and examines coming through the other side of that. I don't think we can devalue the effect that these books could have on maybe a young, impressionable person reading them. I'm long past my angry teenage years. I'm long past other stuff, but those scenes and bits where Jorg reflects on these things really spoke to me. And I think when I read it the first time, I didn't quite, I was still focused on the window dressing, on how I thought these books were cool and really my taste genre-wise and tone-wise. But the more time passes, the more I think it really tapped into that underlying sentiment. Obviously, I don't identify with Jorg's actions, but I identify with Jorg's emotional journey. And I think I'm ready to admit that I always kind of liked Jorg, because while Prince of Thorns was a bit edgy, there was that sense of humour and snarky, cheeky bollocks about him, which is a very Irish thing as well. There's a lot of scenes where he'll do the unpredictable thing. He'll be placed in a situation and you think, well, that might be the noble thing to do or the logical thing to do. And Jorg does completely the opposite because he's just a little bollocks. I find that that's a very Irish thing, and that just pleased me. Back to the seriousness for a second. Overcoming that deep-seated anger and forging your own path in the world is very difficult, but I think Jorg goes on that journey, and by the end of Emperor I feel like you arrive at a place where it's cathartic, to use a word that I don't really like. So ultimately, the Broken Empire trilogy is about a psychological, emotional journey rather than an outward, literal classic fantasy journey. This series really works for me on that level. If you see all of the things that I see and the series still doesn't work for you, that's absolutely fine. Let me know down in the comments what you think. But I think Mark Lawrence is really good at just, like I said, taking a sentiment or an underlying feeling and twisting the dial to 11. He takes what it means to be human, fragile, broken, a highly impressionable young mind, and twist it. He looks at the amount of work it takes to rebuild yourself and to mature and to overcome those things. And ultimately, by the end, he's kind of showing us that you need to trust in other people and love other people in order to do that. And if you allow yourself or don't allow yourself to do it, because often being in those states of mind is quite a selfish thing. So the books are written in that way until slowly he starts to peel back those layers. But again, these books, if you want to go on that journey, I'm sure you'll find that stuff there. If that's not why you read, or if you don't want this in your fantasy book, that's absolutely fine as well. Overall, these books really cemented Mark Lawrence as an automatic buy author for me. I'm currently reading his latest book and it's also really working for me. I just love his genre blends and his prose. The way he writes is just stunningly beautiful. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think of Broken Empire, what you think of what I think about Broken Empire. Philip Chase, if you watch this video, I would love to do another discussion with you. I know it's been like 3 years since you read the books, but hey, you're a man who likes buddy reads, so we could do it again. If you don't like Jorg, if you can't stand Jorg, let me know down in the comments. We can discuss why. That's absolutely valid, and I'll see you guys next time.